Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Making GIS Data Accessible and ADA Compliant. My name is Lindsay Pena, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National States Geographic Information Council. If you are unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance the effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like more information on how to get involved with us, please visit our website at www.nisjic.org. Some reminders for our call today. All attendees have been muted on entrance. There will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, so please place your questions into the chat box. They'll be read aloud and answered at the end of the presentation. Additionally, a recorded version of this webinar will be made available afterwards and posted in the NSGIC knowledge base. With that, I will now turn it over to the presenter.
Thank you so much. So my name is Brandon Biggs, and I am the CEO of XR Navigation, a PhD candidate at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and an engineer at the Smith Cadwell Eye Research Institute. And my research and work focuses completely on how do you make digital geographic maps accessible, especially to blind people, because that's usually a group of folks that's completely left out of the conversation. So I want you to close your eyes and imagine. You smell the smoke and pull up the wildfire evacuation map. Now, with your eyes closed, I want you to tell me how you would evacuate using this map I'm showing on the screen. Keep your eyes closed.
Clickable show street map radio menu item check sub menu out of menu bar map clickable blank blank blank.
Open your eyes. If you're blind, this map is blank. And that's the typical experience that blind people have when accessing ArcGIS. So that's really what we're going to be talking about, how to make usable. So there are two different types of maps when we have a conversation about maps. We've got thematic maps, where there's some kind of numeric or categorical element overlaid on top of the geographic features. And these would be things like COVID statistic maps or utility maps where they're showing, what the different types of utility lines or whatnot are moving around the city. And then we've got referential maps where you have bus routes or other types of, information where navigation or the features themselves are the most important. So both of these are what I'm meaning when I'm talking about geographic maps. I want to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act and how exactly these requirements are going to be changing. The Americans with Disabilities Act Title II regulations are going into effect for state, county, and local governments with populations above 50,000 in April 2026, and then for everybody else in April 2027. So it's coming up very, very quick. And the ADA guidelines require that all digital content meet the web content accessibility guidelines. And these web content accessibility guidelines are a set of, I believe, 76 criteria that they're not perfect, but they're the best that we have when it comes to web content accessibility. And they go through things such as keyboard accessibility, contrast, the roles that are placed on different elements on the screen. So is this a button? It needs to tell the technologies that are using the web that it's a button, that kind of thing. So there are 15 criteria that are particularly applicable to geographic maps, and these include things like non-text content, the roles of the buttons on the interface, the contrast, keyboard accessibility, and our team published a partial accessibility conformance report. So you might have heard of these called VPATs. So VPAT stands for voluntary, I can't remember the exact definition, but it's an accessibility template And so a completed VPAT is called an accessibility conformance report. And so we did the 15 criteria that were particularly applicable to maps, and evaluated the top 13 digital map tools and found that none of them even met the most basic level of compliance out of the box. So these were tools like ArcGIS, Google Maps, Mapbox. So what that means is that when you are creating your geographic maps, you need to actually do some work. They're not going to be accessible out of the box. So the National Federation of the Blind, which represents 50,000 blind people in the US, it's the biggest blindness organization in the world. They recently published a resolution calling on all state and local government entities and institutions of higher education and federal entities to make digital maps accessible. And they kind of really define what I'm going to be talking a little bit about later. They want the ability for blind people to actually become professionals in cartographic-based professions like city planners or different GIS, like a GIS specialist, and so or even a GIS manager. So they want blind people to be in those roles, and they're not currently. Current ways of making maps accessible that you might have heard of are paper maps. The problem is that these are not WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines compliant, so they don't meet the ADA regulations. They also are quite expensive and difficult to get a hold of because they're paper and you have to mail paper around. And only about 10% of blind people actually even know how to read Braille and tactile maps. And so it's a very small population. But if you've got them, they're amazing, and blind people definitely want access to them. If you just put contact information, and I know this has been kind of a recommendation floating around the internet, if you put recommendation information on your website for how to contact someone, that is important. Do that, you need it, but it's not compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so it doesn't meet the new ADA Title II regulations that are coming up. So even though like the current ADA guidelines say that that's acceptable, the new guidelines say it's not acceptable. You need to be meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are 3 guidelines that are really, really difficult to meet, and every single one of those top 13 digital map tools that I showed earlier failed these 3 guidelines. And so we're going to talk about how to meet these 3 guidelines today. They are non-text content, keyboard accessibility, and non-text contrast. So the non-text content, this is the one that is closest to my heart and what my dissertation is on. So I can talk for decades on this one, but I'm going to shorten it down as much as I can. So it states, section 1.1.1 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines states, all non-text content needs to have a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. So non-text content in this case is a visual map, needs to have a text alternative, so basically a text map that serves the equivalent purpose. But what is equivalent purpose when it comes to geographic maps? We've used a definition that was proposed to the International Cartographic Association recently in a publication where they define the purpose of a map to be communicating generalized spatial information and relationships. So generalized means that it's not precise information, but we've kind of abstracted it away. It's symbolic content, and usually this is the points, polygons, and lines on that map. And it's not the real world, but we're getting close as we can. So it's generalized in that respect. The spatial information includes things like the shape, size, orientation of all the different objects on the map. And the spatial relationships are how to get like the distance and direction and location of all the points, polygons, and lines in relationship to each other. So if a map isn't communicating this information. It's not serving the purpose of a map. And we're going to be going through a few examples here to actually evaluate this piece. Um, then there's equivalency. And I like to group equivalency into three different categories, and it's just a subset of what I was mentioning there with the purpose aspect. So we've got the landmark knowledge, which includes this distance, direction, shape, size, orientation, the temporal information, the categorical, overlay categorical variables, uh, the type of all the different points, polygons, and lines on the map. So in the text representation, we need to have all the same information that's communicated in the visual map, uh, looking at these different elements. The survey knowledge is the second aspect, and it includes the distance, direction, exact location, and topological information between all the different points, polygons, and lines. And so the distance is, how many feet or meters is it between any of the different objects on the map? Direction is, what's the angle, clock face direction, north, south, east, and west kind of information. The location is the coordinates, how the different points, polygons, and lines relate to the graticules, if there are graticules on the map. And then the topological information is the like how the different borders interact with each other, how they intersect with one another. And there's a three-part framework that is typically used for looking at different topological information. And so it's basically the internal borders, the bordering, like direct borders, and then the external borders, basically, of the different points, polygons, and lines, and how they relate to each other. And so these are the main core areas for almost every single map that needs to be described in that text description. There's an additional type of knowledge that is particular. Oops, sorry, one sec here. Yeah, it's prompting me on the next slide, and for some reason it's not shutting up when I'm pressing my control key, so I apologize for that. So the next piece here is the root knowledge, and so that basically is the defined routes that are on the map. And typically these are represented through like blue lines, say for example on Google Maps. And so when you're describing the route knowledge information, they need to meet the landmark and survey knowledge that I was mentioning previously. So they should be treated as any other line that's on the map. But additionally, they need to be in a accessible, as prevalent or easy to access as the visual map route information. So if you're creating a detailed text description, for example, an audio description, they need to be at the very top of that description. And so you can really quickly go and find that route information. So it's just, these are the three areas of knowledge that need to be communicated through any different types of text representation. Most traditional alternate text, such as a short text description that says, something like, this is an address at 2318 Fillmore Street, tables, nearby address searches, they don't communicate all this information. But what does communicate all this information? And actually, I'm going to go through a couple examples here. So first, we've got the short text description. So 2318, this is an address of 2318 Fillmore Street. This is a map of 2318 Fillmore Street in San Francisco. And this is the and sorry, this is the visual map of what that text would be. So we've got the alt text here that would be provided to the user. But as you can tell, the visual map has a lot more information than is provided in this text representation. So the visual map is showing, where the different, what the different points, polygons, and lines are on the map, how they're related to each other, their sizes, their shapes, and none of that information is communicated in the alt text that reads, this is a map of 2318 Fillmore Street. So if you just provide this alt text information, it's not accessible. The next is a navigation map using turn-by-turn directions. And I can read these out. So basically, continue along Fillmore Street for 23 meters. I'm going to kind of make this up because I'm not going to read through it exactly. And then turn right onto turn left onto Clay Street, walk 23 meters, and then turn left onto Webster Street, walk 15 meters. And so that's the information that you're given in turn-by-turn directions. The map for this was taken from Google Maps, provides not just one set of turn-by-turn directions, but three, and those are not communicated in the text turn-by-turn directions necessarily. You might be able to flip through them, but by default, it doesn't even tell you that there are three different routes to that destination. And then it doesn't give you any of the underlying variables as well, features as well. So things like the roads that are intersecting that you might be passing along. It doesn't tell you the buildings that you're passing along. And then you don't get any of the actual angles of the streets. So if the streets curve, you're not given any of that information in this text. So it also doesn't meet the accessibility non-text content guidelines. The next one is a COVID statistic map over the US, and this is traditionally represented using a table. And this table will have things like the name of the state, the number of COVID cases, total cases in that state, and there are two different columns on a table, and then you just go through each row, and each row is a different state that tells you its number of COVID cases. So this is also, this is how like the CDC, for example, represents geographic information on their website. And it also doesn't meet the basic requirements for communicating general spatialized information and relationships. So you don't get any of the shape information, you don't get any of the size information, you don't get any of the orientation information or the distance information. So it basically doesn't communicate any spatial information at all. So this is also not compliant. But what is compliant? There are two main types of maps that are compliant with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or ADA. And so one of them is what we call audio descriptions or detailed text descriptions, and the other one is interactive alternate text. Detailed text descriptions are basically the practice that is giving life to the phrase, "A picture is worth 1,000 words." Except in this case, a picture is probably worth a lot more than 1,000 words. There's a organization called Unidescribe that does training on these types of detailed text descriptions. And so these guidelines were taken from them. And so I do a lot of collaboration with the Unidescribe project as well. And they've got a company called Access Hound that's related to them. And they also consult with state and local government entities on how to create their own text descriptions for maps. And so basically, the first element is you need to create a basic summary of the map that gives you an overview of what this map is about. Then you create a heading for both the the route information first. So it needs to be super prevalent that these are the routes, the defined routes through the space, if the map has routes. Most maps don't. And then a heading for the landmark information, and then a heading for the survey information. And then each one of those, you go through each of the different polygons, points, and lines on the map and describe them in detail. And this should be attached as a link to the existing map. So you have a link that says, activate accessible map or open accessible map. And it'll open up this page with that text description. And you can separate this information out through headings. There are a lot of pros with the text description, these detailed text description maps or audio descriptions. First is that they can be read on, in email clients, on any device really that can access text. They don't really require much training to use, and you can create them with your current team and you don't need any extra tools to create. The problem is that they are a separate but equal solution. They do require a lot of maintenance. So whenever you update a new point, polygon, or line, the description needs to be updated as well. They also take a very long time to create. So, how many features does your map have, and how long is it going to take you to describe the shape, size, orientation, topological information, in distance, direction, between all the different other lines on, points, polygons, and lines on the map. There are some techniques that you can use to make these more efficiently, and I've got a guide on our website, xrnavigation.io/blog, and I think I've linked that here in one of the presentation slides for how to create these descriptions, and also the Describe project talks about it as well. But basically, you can create a center point and then describe all the different features in relationship to that center point, or you can grid the map into like 9 different quadrants and then describe each of those different quadrants in relationship to the other different quadrants in the map. So there's a couple different ways to do this, and they're kind of detailed out in these guides. But there is another option, and it's the tool that our company has built. We said this is a really, really arduous process. It takes a very, very long time to create detailed text descriptions, and people just look at a map with 10,000 features on it and say, I'm not even going to try. That's longer than a Harry Potter book, and I'm just not even going to go there. So that's why we created our tool we call Audiom. It's a visual, auditory, and text-based map viewer and editor, and the non-visual experience is very similar to a video game where users hear the text of the sound, so the text of the feature as they're moving over it, using their arrow keys, touchscreen, or other controller. So it's very similar, and you also hear sound, but it's the sounds are just optional. They're not required for web content accessibility guidelines compliance. So here's an example.
First tier section in Nixon Hall. First ramp, trash cans along with ramp. Second row table, west in Nixon Hall.
And this is basically an example of how you would hear. You basically can adjust your step size from this. This was showing like a 1 meter step size to 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers, 100 kilometers. You can adjust that to be whatever you want it to be. And this allows you to explore all the different points, polygons, and lines that are on the map, and it pulls directly from ArcGIS. So rather than needing to describe it, we just take the vector information that is present already in the geographic information system database and then pull that right into Audiom, and there isn't any modification that needs to be done to the data, and then it updates in real time. So you don't need to do any maintenance for this unless you change your schema completely and add in like a whole new structure to the map. This is an example of an Audiom campus map, and if you have headphones on, this would be a great time to put them on.
This is a non-visual version of an Audiom campus map. We're currently at the Visitor Center, and we want to go to the Flight Project Center. I'm going to open a list of all the actions you can do in Audiom that's first letter navigable by pressing F2.
Open main menu, enter. G, get, G, go to dialog. Enter, go to dialog object, clickable, search property page object combo box collapsed has, enter, search property page, F, A, T, down arrow, JPL building 321, Flight Project Center, enter, toolbar, go button, down arrow, listen button, down arrow, description button, down arrow, directions button, enter, JPL building 321, Flight Project Center, building, is 333.9 meters ahead and to the right.
So we can tell it's quite a distance away ahead and to the right. I'm going to escape out of this dialog.
Escape.
And turn on a radar.
Radar enabled.
That will beep in the direction that we need to go and get faster as we get closer. Now I'm going to use my arrow keys to move around the map. Every arrow press will move me 4 meters in that direction, and that's because I have my step size set to 4 meters. I can have it set to whatever I want it to be.
Right arrow, JPL building 249, Visitors Center, building 301.
And what we heard there was the name of the object that we're on, Visitor Center, the type of the object, building and some coordinates that tell us where we are on the map, along with a short sound representing the visitor center.
Right arrow, empty space, 3.
Empty space just means that there's no data for this location, which is pretty typical for maps. There's a lot of empty space on maps.
Right arrow,
Now I hear a building to our right, and I'm gonna go investigate it.
right arrow, JPL building 339, Cuisine Cafe.
Cool, there's a cafe to the right of the visitor center. Now I'm going to open the Nearby Objects menu and see if there's a road that we can follow to the Flight Project Center. I'm gonna press F2.
Open main menu. R, Nearby Objects menu, filter objects 1 of 9. Down arrow, JPL building 300, down arrow, JPL building, down arrow, Mariner Road, 35.6 meters ahead and to the right.
So the road is ahead of us and to the right. I'm gonna close out of this menu
Escape, application,
and go find the road and follow it.
up arrow, empty, up arrow, Mariner Road, 320, right arrow, Mariner Road, right arrow.
Now, I hear something behind us, and so I'm gonna go investigate and see what that is.
Down arrow, JPL building 301, project formulation.
Cool, so project formulation is in between the visitor center and the flight project center. I'm gonna return to the road and continue.
Up arrow, Mariner Road, right arrow.
Alright, and we finished the road, but I hear that we're super close to our destination, so I'm gonna continue.
Right, R, right arrow, JPL building 321, flight projects center.
And we've made it!
The real objective when you're dealing with text alternatives is that somebody's able to professionally work and access the information at a professional level for understanding the spatial information. And so using these conventions, you're able to access everything you need in order to build out city plans or access campuses in order to navigate them or understand where utility lines are in relationship to buildings, all that kind of stuff. And we've performed over 13 academic co-designs and evaluations using this type of technology on 150 blind and 40 sighted participants. And we've not found any statistically significant difference between a visual map and an audio map. I'm going to show you another really quick demo of that was a referential map, and this is a thematic map.
This non-visual version of our inclusive map viewer has 2 modes, a geographic view and a tabular view. We'll start with the tabular view.
Table.
It has a row for each of the different features in the map and a column for each of the different numeric values that could be over one of the features. We'll find an interesting feature.
Alaska row 3 name column 1, North Dakota row 4 name column 1.
And an interesting numeric value.
292,604 row 4 total cases column 2, 383,964 row 4 cases per 1 million column 3.
And what we heard there was a pitch that's relative to the other pitches in this column, so we can tell that North Dakota has a higher cases per 1 million than many of the other states. When I press enter on this cell, the statistic that's shown over all the different features on the geographic view will switch to cases per 1 million, and I will be jumped to North Dakota.
North Dakota.
Now I can use my arrow keys to move around 1 kilometer each arrow press. And I'm going to answer the question, what state bordering North Dakota has the highest number of cases per 1 million?
North Dakota, Minnesota, 300, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, South, North, Minnesota, North, South, North, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, North, empty, North Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota.
So what we heard there was Minnesota actually has the highest number of cases per 1 million bordering North Dakota, but North Dakota itself has higher cases per 1 million than Minnesota. We didn't know that before.
So there's a lot of pros and cons to interactive alt text. Like I was mentioning, some of the pros are that it automatically pulls in any geographic data that's updated in the database. It syncs with ArcGIS. It can be embedded into any existing ArcGIS Experience Builder application, and we're in the midst of creating an Experience Builder widget that will just plug into it automatically. So that's on our pipeline. And then Some of the cons are that it does take some, getting used to use. So just like using ArcGIS takes some training to use, Audiom does take about 2 minutes to, there's an interactive tutorial that we ask people to complete in order to learn how to use Audiom. And so it does take a little bit of training to use, and it's interactive. So you can't necessarily use it directly from an email client. Um, so non-text contrast is the next element that I want to go over. And basically what this requirement states is that you need to have a 3-to-1 ratio for any feature that's on the map. And so here's an example of why having a 3-to-1 ratio is so important. So we've got a set of colors, and then when you look at it through the perspective of somebody who's colorblind, they're not able to distinguish them apart. So this also applies for somebody who's low vision. They won't be able to distinguish apart different shades of blue, for example, if they're not using that 3-to-1 ratio. But the problem is that if you've got more than 3 elements on that map, you can't really use a 3-to-1 ratio because there's, it's a 3-to-1 ratio. So you have to have another option. So there's a couple different ways that you can go about meeting this criteria. One is you should always, always, always use as high of contrast as possible, even if it doesn't meet 3-to-1 ratio. If you can go even through 2 different colors, and be as high of contrast as possible, that's what you should do. But to meet the criteria, you can use patterns. And so instead of using colors, you can have a different set of patterns that are used for each of the different categorical values or numeric ranges on the map. And this is really useful for somebody who is colorblind. It is not helpful for somebody who's low vision, though. They really need that high contrast to be present in order for them to understand the map as high contrast as possible. They do not like patterns because it's really confusing and hard to read visually. Then for creating borders around the different features, you can do what's called Oreo borders. And this is when you have a 3-layer border. It has either black or white on the edges, and then in the center it has either black or white as a contrast to what the edges are. So you could have one black, one white, one black line, or one white, one black, one white line, and you just need to make sure that it's 3-to-1 ratio with the color that it's next to. So that's basically how you can meet this particular type of guideline. And but I still highly recommend having as high of contrast as you can between the different colors on the map. The final area that I'm going to look at talk about is keyboard accessibility. So normally maps allow you to zoom in and out or around the map using the arrow keys, and this is pretty typical for maps. The problem is that keyboard accessibility says that whatever you can do with all the aspects of the map need to be fully accessible using the keyboard, period. So if you can click on a feature and get more information about that feature, it needs to be accessible through the keyboard. So what are some options for doing this? You can use lists, tables, or menus for creating basically access to the different features on that map. So this is what Audiom does. We create a menu that lists out all the different features on the map, or a table that lists out all the different features on the map. And then if you need to click on that to get more information about that feature, or to select it, or to do some kind of action on it, you can do that through the menu, or you can also do it through the geographic view as well. So menus are a really great option for just listing out all the different features. That's really great for keyboard accessibility. And then it's also good if you're able to communicate the shape, size, orientation, and all the other spatial information that I was mentioning earlier as well. So this needs to be in combination with all the other aspects that I've been mentioning. So adding a list of all these different features on the map is really helpful. If you categorize them, it makes it a little bit more user-friendly, especially if you've got thousands of features on the map. And so you can kind of drill down into different types of features that you want. Drawing is the final aspect that I want to talk about because this is often missed when talking about accessibility, but if you want to print ArcGIS map, for example, or you need to do some kind of analytics on the map, you need to be able to draw a bounding box around the different features. The best way to do this, and this is what we do in Audiom, is you allow the user to move a little cursor around the map. So like we do with the character, and then you can drop different points as vertices around the different maps. So I've got an example here of a character moving around a map and dropping points to create a rectangle. And so that's how you would create something like a bounding box just using the keyboard. If you have maps such as transit maps or trail maps or city zoning maps in your agency, there's a 99% chance that they're not accessible just because work typically hasn't been done to make them accessible out of the box. And like I was mentioning earlier, none of the tools are accessible out of the box. So if you've got any ArcGIS map in your in your agency, then there's a 99% chance that they are not accessible and they need some of this remediation work. Usable maps should be expected. So like the National Federation of the Blind requested, blind people want to be part of the GIS community. They want to work in professions such as city planning and epidemiology or oceanography. But right now, the barrier to entry is so high that they're not able to participate in those professions just because even getting a degree in or even taking any kind of geography class or basic climate class or anything related to GIS is extremely difficult. And so when you're creating these types of maps, uh, they really should be expected to be accessible. And so that's why the digital accessibility guidelines are being created. And that's really the reasoning behind them is because they haven't been made accessible up to this point, and we need them to be accessible as the blind community. So I've got an evaluation tool here that's on my website that you can go and evaluate your maps against these 15 criteria that I was mentioning. And it walks you through how to download a contrast checker. So rather than looking visually at or doing math to understand if it's a 3-to-1 ratio, you can actually just use a tool. I recommend the Axe Accessibility plugin. ArcGIS also has some guides on their website on using contrast bigger tools as well, but they basically all do the same thing. And when you use these tools, you can look at the map and understand if they are meeting that 3-to-1 ratio. We also go through in this guide on how to use, I linked to some guides on how to use screen readers. So you hear my screen reader going in the background. Yours doesn't need to go that fast. It can be much, much slower. But when you rely on a screen reader, you definitely speed it up because otherwise life is just way too slow. So this tool is free on our website. You can just download it. It's a Word file. You can go through and do it. It's like a checklist that you go through to see how the map is accessible. Our vision here at Exo Navigation and why I'm doing my PhD is that every map is usable. All the maps are usable to everyone. But this is not something that we can do alone. We need everyone to be advocating in your agency for accessibility because people want it. Civic engagement requires it. So for example, my transit agency recently published a set of a complete redesign of the bus routes around the city and asked for public comment. I went onto the website to give my feedback and to view what the changes were. And the very first element on that survey was an inaccessible map. And so I wasn't able to give any of my feedback, even though as a blind person, I rely on the bus system to get around the city. I don't have another option other than public transit and maybe Ubers. But disabled people are the ones relying on public transit, and as it currently stands, they're not able to have their voice being heard because the maps are not accessible. So it's really, really important that map accessibility is part of the strategy and the goals of your agency. So what questions do you have for me? I know this was a lot of information, but I hope there's some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. We did have a few questions coming through. And if you are still on the call and want to elaborate where these questions came through, please feel free to come off of mute and elaborate on your question. But the first question I have was from Jessica Sprickler. And she asked, are there ways to embed that into a PDF map instead of having to instead of having a separate link for non-web content?
Um, I really highly recommend a separate link for having a map link to a map an interactive map on a website for PDFs. PDFs are really not like blind people hate them for a many different reasons. They're extremely hard to make accessible, and they're actually not really possible to make accessible when it comes to complex graphics. So the best thing to do is to link out. But if you can't link out for one reason or another, the best option is to create a detailed text description and then have that somewhere at the bottom of the PDF or somewhere around the PDF so that you can jump to it with a link. But yeah, there's not really a good option for PDFs other than linking out or creating a detailed text description at the bottom of the PDF that you can jump to in a link in that PDF. You can also do EPUB 3, which is taking too long to catch on, but basically those are web publishable open, web documents that anybody can read in their browser or using different types of e-readers. And those are something that you can definitely embed an interactive map on as well.
Great, thank you for that. And I'll just continue with some comments. So Greg Rothwell mentioned, wow, I'm genuinely learning so much from this talk and demo. What an amazing presentation. I'm so glad that we
Thank
found it
you.
useful. And if anyone else wants to get off of mute and let Brandon know your name and what question you might have. Happy to have you all do so.
I have a question, if that's all right. My name's Scott Davis. I work for the state of Utah, the Utah Geospatial Resource Center. And I'm just curious, like, I think it would be cool to have some accessible maps of some of our more popular data layers that we house in our office. And I'm just wondering, like, how would we go about doing that? Is that something that we would contact you through the XR navigation website, or is there an API that we can use to build
Yeah.
these maps on our own?
Exactly. So if you want to work with, my company, which is, then I would definitely recommend contacting us through the website. There's another company called Access Hound that specializes in the detailed text descriptions that I was mentioning, and they're called Access Hound. I think it's accesshound.com. And so they would be another company you could contract with. Otherwise, go to unidescribe.org, and there's some tutorials in there on how you can make your own detailed text descriptions. But Audiom is a platform like ArcGIS, and it's a commercial platform just like ArcGIS, and so it kind of we do kind of an enterprise license for that, and we have an SDK that you can hook up directly to your feature layers in ArcGIS. But yeah, reach out to us if you want to work with us specifically.
All right, I have a question
Will do,
from
thanks.
Jane Schaefer Kramer asked, does Audiom work on interactive as well as static maps?
Absolutely, 100%. It's really built for the interactive maps primarily, but it definitely works on static maps as well. But like I was mentioning earlier, PDF maps, you really have to link out to, so typically static maps are PDFs or images that you expect somebody to download. And in that case, having the alt text on the map is great, but you should really have a link out to an interactive map that somebody can explore, because PDFs just aren't keyboard accessible. They're not something that you can use. Like they don't have any kind of interactivity with them, and so like you're really limited in that PDF. And so You can have the detailed text description underneath or have it linked out separately.
And Daniel Stovall asks, can you tell how accessibility changes when designing for mobile versus desktop?
Accessibility really doesn't change a lot. The web content accessibility guidelines are built to be for both. For Audiom specifically, you still need to have keyboard accessibility even if you're on mobile. But what we did specifically for touchscreens is we have a little panel that pops up with buttons that you can use. And so you can use a keyboard with your phone, or you can use this panel that we created where you got the arrow keys, you double tap on any one of those arrow keys, it moves you one step, you double tap and hold, and it repeatedly moves you in a direction. And then you can open up an edit box where you can type in keyboard commands, or you've got a menu that you can access all the different keyboard commands through. And so that's basically how you use Audiom non-visually through a touch screen. And so it doesn't really that's the main part that changes. The interface itself, the idea of moving the character around the map doesn't change at all.
Christina Bell asks how to go about bringing this up to employer. And then she put consulting firm for reference.
It depends who you are and how you're going about like if you're disabled yourself and you want to bring this up to an employer so that you can actually do your job, that's a pretty strong justification, and companies, organizations like the National Federation of the Blind can help you advocate for employer rights. I don't know a lot about the employer. I think that's Title 4 of the ADA for employer rights. I could be wrong on that. Maybe it's Title 1 actually. I don't remember. It's one of those titles. And basically, you as the employee do have a lot of rights, and Audiom is definitely something that you can push for as an employee to your organization. If it comes to making your content accessible, then you can bring up these ADA Title II regulations that are going into effect in April, and that should be plenty of inspiration for them to move forward on this. Otherwise, you can go and find statistics of the number of disabled people in your county. And I like to use national statistics and then infer them back to your existing, entity, like your county or city or whatever you're working for. And you can use those national statistics to kind of infer or, kind of guess how many people are in your county that are disabled or illiterate or somebody who's not able to use or read a geographic map.
Daniel Stovall asked another question. With the limitations in accessibility on ArcGIS online tools / instant apps, what are the top 3 easiest things you can recommend for public content / apps?
So ArcGIS has a color contrast checker tool, and that is definitely something they've put a lot of thought and effort into. And so you can go and use an ArcGIS Pro, their I think it's called the color deficiency checker, something like that. And so there's some videos on how to use that. So that's definitely number one. Number two is I would just make sure that as much as your data as possible is in an interactive format. So using vector data and so you've got it in there. It's not static maps because static maps just have a lot of issues like I've been mentioning. And then number three is work to make the like an integration with this non-text content. That's super important for just number of people. So in theory, like the visual map itself is not legally required. You really only need the text map on there. So if you could remove something, it would be the visual map, but I know that's not going to happen. So if you add it in the text map, that would be awesome as well.
So Thomas Logan had a question. Chancey Fleet from New York Public Library talked about image poverty in education for many people who are blind. She mentioned that many children who are blind are not taught to explore or understand visual maps. Have you thought about getting Audiom into into education systems for people of all ages who are blind to learn that they can get information from visual maps?
Yeah, so I want to kind of step back a little bit and kind of demonstrate the magnitude of this problem. I want you to raise your hand if you have seen a digital map in the last week. These would be navigation maps, weather maps, war maps. Able-bodied people view 300 maps a year on average, and if you work in GIS, that exponentially increases to thousands of maps per year. Contrast that with blind people who view less than one. This is the image poverty that Thomas is talking about and Chancey Fleet mentions and discusses. As a blind person, I haven't ever viewed a hurricane map, for example. I've never viewed a fire map. I've never viewed most of the different types of maps that we've taken for granted. When I've done research, one of the biggest requests that I have is, can I view and understand what people mean when they talk about gerrymandering? Because blind people just don't have access to these types of maps. But to answer Thomas's question, specifically, yes, I was actually on a call this morning with a potential partner who works with K-12 schools and to get something like Audiom into those into schools. And we've been working with teachers of the blind and orientation mobility specialists to get Audiom used in different pieces of curricula. So it's definitely something we've been working on, but we're really focused heads down on the meeting the ADA Title II regulations because I know everybody's worried about those, and I know the National Federation of the Blind is also gearing up to make sure that everybody is meeting those guidelines as well.
And just from perspective, Brandon, you had an explosion of hands raised when you asked that question from our participants. I think just about everybody's hand raised. Francesca asks, can you restate what you said about having a button in Experience Builder? What does the button do? Is it currently available, or are you working with Esri to include one in a future release?
So when I was talking about a button, it basically is a link on Experience Builder or a custom, it would be in a custom widget or being a link where you could link out to a separate site or open up a dialog with the accessible map on there, whether that's an audio map or whether that's a detailed text description. So it's basically, you would create a button at the top of the map, somewhere that's very easy to find. In one of the very first elements of that map that says open accessible map or activate read text description or something to that effect. I like to say open accessible map, and then that's going to open up a new page that has the text description on there or the Audiom widget on there. And we are working with ArcGIS, so we are an official ArcGIS partner right now, and we're in the midst of building our Experience Builder widget. But right now, it is basically a button or a link where you open up a dialog or a separate page to access that map.
Steve Hook asked, what would be the best way to provide a text-based description for an interactive county web map that is around 418 square miles with all of its features?
Again, like I said, I mean, I'm gonna give you the biased response, which is you should use Audiom because that'll do it pretty quickly. And you don't need to worry about updating it, updating the text description. The other option is you can go feature by feature down the list and describe each one of them using the spatial landmark, spatial knowledge framework that I was mentioning with the landmark route and survey knowledge. So you just need to go feature by feature and then create a description of how each of those relate to each other and the spatial information present in each one of those features. And so it can take a while, but it's definitely doable. And I know the National Parks Foundation has been, the National Park Service has been doing a lot of work to try and do that for their parks. They're still working on it, and they haven't, they don't have, some of their maps are missing some features, but they're working on it. I wouldn't necessarily say that is completely compliant, but it's definitely it's moving the needle a little bit. And so I think, as these new ADA Title II regulations are going into effect, they're going to be tightening up some of those descriptions and making sure they're more systematic. So, it's kind of a very tedious systematic process to create these detailed text descriptions, but it's super important because you really don't know when somebody's looking at the map what they're looking at. And they really need access to all those features. Otherwise, why did you put it on the map?
Megan Ferry asks, are there any existing Esri out-of-the-box tools that can improve accessibility of web maps, such as Maps in Experience Builder?
Absolutely. So the one that I mentioned earlier is that color contrast checker and for color blindness, and I think somebody linked to it a little bit earlier in the Zoom. That is the main one that Esri has built in. But if you contact Esri and say, hey, please integrate Audiom by default, that would be an awesome thing that you could do, and we might get an Audiom default experience in Esri.
All right, we are almost at the top of the hour. I'll do one last question unless you are able to stay on a little
Yeah,
bit
I can stay on
longer.
for a little bit longer.
Okay, perfect, because we do have quite a few other questions. So Nathan Burke, our city has maps on ArcGIS Online that display layers upon layers of data, parcel, centerline, zoning, sewer, storm, et cetera, all in one place. Would providing a link to certain accessible map options through a splash screen be the same as making one single map accessible? Or what is the best method to make a very large interactive map more accessible?
Since you have it all in one map, I would say that you probably should make one map for the text descriptions as well. Thus saying, you can have the kind of separate out the different properties. So you could have like a table showing all the different features associated with the properties. Then you could have another section where you talk about the landmark and survey information and route information if that is relevant for each of the different features. And so you basically have, them connected to each other through links, but you can have all the different properties associated with those features in a separate area than you have the actual descriptions of the geometries. So like I was showing in that COVID statistic map, you can have a separate table that does provide the categorical and numeric values overlaid on top of the map in like a separate area. That's perfectly fine. You just need to make sure that those geometries are also provided for each of the different points, polygons, and lines as well. But Audiom handles, I think the biggest map we've done to date has had about 25 layers. But we could definitely add more on there. And there's no limit so far that we've reached on how many layers we can have on Audiom.
Lillian Hayden mentioned, sorry if I missed it, but is this compatible with vector data only?
Yes, at the moment, vector data is primarily what Audiom uses. If you have raster data and you've got a way to kind of query that raster data for the geometries in there, we can kind of parcel it up into different sections. And so if you've got statistical information overlaid, in that raster data, then we can access that information. We basically convert that raster data into little tiny polygons, little tiny rectangles around the Earth. And so that's how we would handle a raster map like that. But if it's an image, there still needs to be a cartographer who converts that into vector data.
If Experience Builder will eventually have a button to create an accessible map, can it also automatically generate a supplemental accessible map based on the map already created?
That's something you're going to need to bring up with ArcGIS. I hope so. Like what we're planning with our Experience Builder widget that we're building as a third-party widget is that you basically tell Audiom where the different properties are to name the different features and then give a set of types like is this a road, is this a bridge, and then those kind of hook up with different sounds that the map has in its sound pack.
David Minton asks, for a text description of a PDF parcel map that contains parcel numbers, lot numbers, streets, dimensions, etc., Would a good description be something like a parcel map within city that contains the following parcel numbers with links to web pages for those parcels?
I would need to look more at the parcel numbers. Sorry, that map specifically, but um, if the links to each of the different parcel numbers contains the geometry information for each parcel, and then also there's an area where it describes how each of those parcels relate to each other through the distance, direction, topological information, and coordinates. If you've got, actual coordinates on the map or graticule lines, then that's what you need. Just having the different, features described individually is not good enough. You need to have an understanding of that map and how it is laid out to somebody else. A good practice that I say is ask somebody a question that you would use your map for. So, like, which plot should I build my apartment building on, or something like that. And that is basically a question that they should be able to answer with the text descriptions. And then you also need to be thinking about the usability of this as well. So is it really practical that somebody's going to be clicking on 1,000 different links to understand, the layout of the map? Probably not. They're probably going to want to find what they're interested in first, and then you drill down into that. And so basically, if you can create that overview of the description of the map at the beginning, that kind of gives you an overview, and then maybe the survey information at the beginning, and then go through each of the different landmarks and have a link out to them, that might work.
All right, I am going to give the group one last chance to come off mute and ask their questions, if there are any. Otherwise, Brandon, we had a ton of comments saying how much everyone enjoyed the presentation today. It will be available in the NISJIC knowledge base once it has been processed. So that will be coming out soon.
And I actually need to head off, but yeah, if you have any questions, please send me an email at brandon.biggs@xrnavigation.io.
Well, we really
And
appreciate you today.
thank you
And
so much.
Thank you, Brandon. Great
Yeah, thank
presentation.
you.
thank you all for joining, and make sure to share with friends once it's in the NISJIC knowledge base.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great
Bye.
day.
Thank you.